Welcome everybody to today's interview, where I'm going to be asking Ratnaguna about a very important topic indeed, which is the individual or the true individual, and topics that are related to it. I think it is very important because of what's happening in today's world, and it's a very important concept, I think, not just for Buddhist practitioners, but for people in general. So, Ratnaguna, the individual, or the true individual, could you please unpack that for us? What do you mean by it? What is meant by it?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm not a true individual yet by a long way, but I'm very inspired by the idea, and I try my best to be an individual at all times. And I first came across the idea, must be almost 50 years ago now, when I went to a Ratna Buddhist Center, FWBO Buddhist Center, as we used to say, and listened to a lecture by Advayacitta, the founder of the movement and our teacher. And he talked about individuality. In fact, there was a whole series of lectures, a series of 8 lectures on the topic of the individual, the group, and the spiritual community. And I would say that ever since then, that has been one of the main things that I think about and I study and I try to put into practice, because, as you say, I think it's very, very important. You just said it's very important, especially now. It is very important now. I don't know if it's especially important now as opposed to previous times. I think it's always very, very important. So what do we mean by the individual, the true individual? In order to unpack that, I need to talk about 2 other things, as Sangharakshita did. There's the individual and the group, and there's also the individualist, which is somewhat different from the individual. Let me talk about the group first. The group is a bunch of people who have lots in common. Let's say a tribe. A tribe is a good way of thinking about the group. A tribe is a people who live together, who have the same viewpoints, who see the world in the same way, probably have the same religion, and so on. They were the oldest kind of groups, at least. But these days, we have all sorts of groups. We have political groups, political parties. We have countries, nations, which are groups. And we have things like clubs, football clubs. Football fans are obviously very tribal, very groupish. My group against yours. And very often, actually, that's how the world is. It's one group against another, or one group against many groups against many groups, and so on. There are alliances between groups. The important thing, I suppose, about the group is they have one set of views which are the same as each other, or I should say all members of that group have a similar kind of worldview, and that's the way they see the world. And when people from another group, let's say another country or another political party, have a different view, then they oppose one another. And when you're a group member, you don't really think for yourself, depending on how much of a group member you are. Let's take an extreme example. An extreme group member takes on the views of the group completely and utterly. They don't really think for themselves at all. Not all group members are so extreme, of course. So the individual, in this sense, is someone who has somehow emancipated themselves from the power of the group that they come from. That's really what an individual is. And I was just thinking this morning, actually, there are 3 main, let's say, characteristics of the individual from which all other characteristics arise. And the first one is they are aware of themselves. They are aware of themselves as a person, an individual person. They have what we call reflexive self-awareness, in that when you're an individual, you do something or you say something and you have the ability to think, oh, is that right what I just did? Or is it true what I just said? You've got to step back from what you've just said or done, and you think about it. So reflexive self-awareness, I think, is the seed of individuality. And there are two other aspects of it which I think are really, really important, is that when you realize that you are a separate person, as well as being a group member, you also have your own thoughts and so on, you realize at the same time that other group members are actually individual people and they're important. And that brings the third element to it, which is the sense of responsibility. You can only really take responsibility for yourself when you are aware of yourself as an individual person. And that's why some people who are usually very, very decent people can do some unspeakably horrible things in the name of the group. But an individual just won't do that. They can't do that. They're aware of themselves. They're aware that other people are like themselves. And so they take responsibility for their whatever they say, whatever they do, whatever they think, and so on, because actions have consequences. I suppose that's one important thing, that an individual realizes that their actions have consequences, and those consequences can be very, very important.
Right. So they are reflexively self-aware and take responsibility.
Yes.
And aware that other people are not just members of the group as well, but actually, to some extent or other, individual people in their own right as well.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's quite interesting that in some of the Pali Suttas, the Buddha talks about how everybody, let's talk about me. I am very dear to myself. I really matter. And I'm dear to myself. And one of the ways that the Buddha taught ethics was to say, just as you're dear to yourself, other people are as dear to themselves as you are to yourself. And that is a very, very important notion, I think. And from that comes ethics, and also from that comes the metta or loving kindness.
So there's very definitely an emotional aspect to this as well.
Yes, very strongly. Yes.
One could say what emotional positivity goes along with the reflexibility and awareness of oneself as a person in relation to others.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And in a moment, I'll talk about the individualist. That's a very important distinction. But before that, I just want to say something, which is that Sangharakshita used to teach quite strongly about the individual. But somebody pointed out to him that there's no teaching like that in the ancient Buddhist text. There's no teaching of the individual, the characteristics of the individual, as opposed to the group and so on. But he has been challenged on that a couple of times in seminars. And at one time he said, well, you could say that viveka is an aspect of individuality. That's a way that the Buddha talks about individuality. So viveka means, well, actually, I've got it in the Pali English dictionary here. I'm just going to read you the definition of viveka here. This is in very small letters, so I need to use my... Where are we? Viveka. Here we are. Viveka means separation, detachment, seclusion. But then, whoever wrote this dictionary said singleness. And singleness is inverted commas, singleness, and then in parentheses of heart, singleness of heart. And then discrimination, and then in parentheses of thought. So you get these two aspects, the singleness of heart and the discrimination of thought. But also he once said that when he first started teaching his teachings on individuality, he said he considered using the Pali word pugala, or the Sanskrit word pudgala.
Oh, yeah.
I just looked it up this morning, and pudgala means person, an individual as opposed to a group. An individual as opposed to the group. Now, that's very interesting, isn't it? So the reason he decided not to use the word pudgala, because there's a great controversy has always been a controversy between the Pudgalavardins and the Theravadins about the nature of the self, which we need not go into here, but he decided against that because of that controversy. But I thought that was very interesting that he considered using that word, Pudgala.
Mhm. Indeed. Yes. Well, it seems to go with what the nature of the self is, although I'm trying to avoid that topic, but the nature of a person. And I suppose this brings us to the question of the individualist, and contrasting the individual to the individualist. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll put
Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking that the individual is always a person in relation to others, in contrast to the individualist, who's really thinking only of themselves. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in my article for Apamada that was published a little while ago on, I can't remember which one it is now. Both the first one on individuals and this on tribes, and the second one on individuals. I make the point that there are, I've discovered in my own mind anyway, 4 kinds of individualist, and one of them is just a selfish person. And to be honest, I can't remember the others now, but anyway, they're in that article. The article is called Individuals. So there are different ways of being an individualist. And one of them actually is just to be different. You know, some people really, really try very hard to be different. They wear different clothes than everybody else. They speak differently from everybody else. But that doesn't mean to say they're an individual. They just might be trying to distinguish themselves as a person, to, you know, make themselves feel better that they really do exist.
Yes. Well, I suppose it brings up an interesting topic. It's like membership of groups, but also the pecking order within the group as well,
yes.
and putting yourself somewhere, trying to put yourself at the top of that as well, perhaps. And you might want to stand out in some way by doing something a bit different, shall we say, or it might be a way of doing it. Yeah, I think these are very human characteristics, and it's and such very important ones to be able to understand and actually move beyond in our practice.
Yes. You mentioned you know, the pecking order, and you try to get to the top, but I think there are probably people who don't want to be at the top. That's too much responsibility. And I'm thinking especially of that sketch. It wasn't exactly Monty Python's, but it had there were 3 people in it, the 2 Ronnies and John Cleese, and they're all at different heights. And John Cleese was the posh person with the tall, and he said, you know, he was talking about him being the top and so on. The smaller one, Ronnie Barker, said, "I know my place," which is at the bottom. And of course, the Buddha talks about that, didn't it? 3 kinds of conceit: superiority conceit, inferiority conceit, and equality conceit. Each one of them is a form of conceit.
Indeed, and I think that in itself is a topic that I think is very important to unpack these days as well. You know, actually that it's a conceit to think you're better than other people, but also it's a conceit to think you're worse than everybody else.
Yes.
And thirdly, it's a conceit to believe you're equal to everybody else.
Yes. So what's the what's the Buddha's remedy for that kind of conceit is to stop comparing yourself with others. That's the problem.
Indeed.
And I must say, all my life, all my earlier life, I was always comparing myself with others. And strangely enough, I compared myself badly to others. I was the one at the bottom, but I always had that kind of sense of not being good enough and so on. And it's all to do with comparisons. As Oscar Wilde said, all comparisons are odious. And when you start comparing yourself to other people, you get in a very bad state, because you either think you're superior, or you think you're equal, or you're wondering, you know, am I the same as that person? Is he better or worse? What's the point of that, you know?
Well, indeed. Indeed. Yeah. But I think, you know, it's a human characteristic. You know, perhaps it goes back to our, you know, ancient tribal time, 100,000 years or so ago,
Yes.
or more ago. It's
Yes.
perhaps people had to think about where they were in the group.
It was actually essential for
Yeah,
their survival, wasn't
yeah.
it? A
Oh,
group
yes.
needed to survive.
Mm.
And to do that, they had to know the groups that were threats to them.
Yes.
And
Oh,
that,
yes.
yes. So,
Mm.
so there's always this sense of threat. If you were a caveman or whatever, you were very, very vulnerable. And I think that's why it's so strong in us now, because it's very difficult, even in our modern democracy, where we do have free speech, although that's being undermined by certain groups. But we do have free speech. And the worst thing that can happen is that we're cancelled. We say something that doesn't go down very well with a certain group, and they manage to cancel us or
Yeah.
shun us in some way. And sometimes people lose their job and their career because of that cancelling. But that's the very worst that can happen, which is not the end of the world, as it would be with an ancient society. You could be killed very easily for having the wrong kind of opinion.
Oh, indeed.
But I
Yeah.
think because of the evolutionary urge within us, it feels as strong to be cancelled as it does to be killed. That the fear around it is as strong as that, I think, with some people.
Yes. Well, perhaps that relates to having a sense of identity that's in some way bound up with the group. And if it's threatened, then your identity is completely threatened, perhaps. So it's not
Yes,
just a question, oh, people disagree with me, and it's far more central issue than that. Yes.
it is. Yes,
Yeah.
and I've read three very, very good books about the
Uh-huh.
individual and the group in the past couple of years. One of them is Conformity by Cass Sunstein. He's a professor of law in America, and he's done a lot of research, and he draws on a lot of research about group dynamics, what happens, and conformity as opposed to individuality. It's a very, very interesting book. Then there's the book that you recommended to me, actually, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan
Oh, yeah.
Haidt.
Yeah.
He's a socio-psychologist. He's done a lot of research too. And the third one is called The Grip of Culture by Andy West. Now, reading those books, I learnt a lot. They really taught me much more than I knew before about group dynamics and the need to belong to a group. I think it's Andy West's book, The Grip of Culture, where he says that you can tell when you're in a group, or what he calls, what does he call it? A cultural entity, which is his word for a group. You can tell when you're in a group when someone from another group criticizes the view of your group and you feel threatened.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, what he calls hot. You have hot emotions in response to that. Why does it hurt me so much when somebody says something against my group? Is because they're not only threatening an idea that the group I have happens to hold, but they're threatening my very identity.
Yeah.
And that's why we get so heated in conversations, especially political ones.
Oh, indeed. Yes. 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 And it makes it very difficult at times to have political conversations.
Almost impossible sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just people shouting at each other, isn't it? Not listening at all. It's awful, absolutely awful.
Yes. Well, I had an interesting example of this. It wasn't shouting. It's the political scientist Matt Goodwin, and he was relating a conversation he had and how the other person was treating him, and it was ad hominem attacks.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, not rational discussion at all. And in front of an audience that agreed with the person who agreed politically with the person who was doing the ad hominem attacks on him. I don't think it fussed him particularly. He's just using it as an example of where we are politically these days, and the problem of discussion between, one could call what he calls the elites, and the majority of people. There is a large gulf.
Yes.
But what was clear was there was no discussion really.
Yes, that takes us back to the righteous mind. So I'll just say a little bit about that, because I think it's a really great insight that Jonathan Haidt has had, which is that we all have a righteous mind, and it's activated when somebody has a very different opinion than ours. So we don't just think, well, that opinion's wrong, you're mistaken. We think that's a bad opinion to have, and you must be a bad person to have that opinion. And that's what ad hominem arguments, I think there's a connection there, because if you say, no, that's a really bad thing, that's typically of your kind of people, that makes that person in that group a bad person and a bad group.
Indeed, yes. And yes, well, the goodies and the baddies.
Yes.
It is interesting that such a distinction is so very much within human psychology, basic human psychology. And as part of our spiritual development, we need to be aware of it and be able to overcome it and sort of transcend it.
Yes.
Which is what being an individual is trying to be. Right?
Well, I'm just thinking now that, Sangharakshita came up with a number of qualities or characteristics of the individual. And as the years went by, he added to them. And I think we could add, the individual does not experience righteous indignation. They don't respond to people in that kind of way. Righteous indignation is a way of somehow dismissing somebody, not only their argument, but that person too, as not worth listening to.
Oh, indeed. It's seeing yourself. I'm the moral one here, and this person is so immoral as not to be worth paying attention to, or certainly not taking seriously. That sort of thing. Yeah. Well, brings in the whole question of the ego as well.
It does, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, which I suppose could take us off at the tangent, which is the sort of relationship between one's ego, one's attachment to a particular sense of self, and one's attachment to the group.
Yes.
But that I think is subject to exploration that will take lots of work to do.
Well, I could say something to that, because the Buddha, as we know, the Buddha taught spiritual friendship as being really, really important. In fact, the whole of the spiritual life. He said twice, actually, that I found anyway. He may have said it more times, but I've discovered 2 suttas when he says the spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. But he also taught the importance of viveka, which is solitude. It's important to be, and there's a whole sutta about that, isn't it? They wander lonely as a rhinoceros horn. And I think that the ability to be in solitude is an extremely important aspect of developing individuality. If you can't be on your own, you can't really be with other people. That's I think the 2 things are very, very connected, actually. Solitude and friendship are very connected, that you can't really be a friend, in other words, unless you're able to be on your own. Because how does that work then? So I suppose you can only be a friend to the extent that you're able to be self-reliant. And that self-reliance helps you to be really with another person, especially, let's say, when they're having a hard time, or when you disagree with them or something, that you don't cut them off, but you're able to remain with them because I suppose you've got a certain amount of inner strength yourself.
Yes. The term or phrase that keeps coming up for me when you're talking there is self and other.
Now, self what?
And other. The self and the other actually go together. That's what friendship's about. But it's got to be, as it were, what should we, to use another phrase, a true self, a true individual with another. And friendship is about developing one's individuality, but in relationship to others and within in the process of friendships.
Yes.
I sort of put it like that. And in saying that, I'm thinking about a 20th century Scots philosopher called John McMurray. I don't know if you've ever come across him, who wrote some interesting books on this theme, self and other. and persons, I think, persons in relation. Yeah.
Yes.
Which I found
Yes.
very, very interesting books. I think I came across them a long time ago. Thought, and there are definite similarities with Buddhist thinking here, and certainly
Yes.
Sangharakshita's thinking. Yeah.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've read by him is where he talks about what we call positive emotions like metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, and so on. He spoke about them as being appropriate emotions. So an example would be you're walking along the street and an old person is in front of you and they trip over a curb. The appropriate thing is to go and help them.
Yeah.
Right. It's completely inappropriate just to walk past them, isn't it? It's
Yep.
just everyone would agree that that's not an appropriate response. So that just as you can say that views can be appropriate or right or wrong, you could say the same about one's emotional response to other people. They're either right or wrong. Right or wrong is perhaps not quite the right word, but appropriate or inappropriate.
Yeah.
And it's inappropriate to connect it back to what we were just saying, to cancel someone. It's inappropriate to use ad hominem arguments on them.
Indeed, and I'm thinking here, the Buddha never did that.
He never, ever did it. No,
Yes.
never.
Yeah.
And of course, people tried to do it to him, and his response to that was very interesting. He just wouldn't have it.
Indeed, yes, he wouldn't. he wouldn't get caught up in it at all. Yes.
No.
It's what I remember 40 odd years ago, sort of reading, I think it was the Majjhima Nikaya, the Middle-Length Sayings. I was just struck again and again by the Buddha's demeanor and how he would discuss with people in a very friendly, caring, considerate, and very rational, evidence-based way.
Yes.
It was very, very striking.
Yes.
He was well, I think, exemplifying being an individual, treating another person as an individual who mattered. Yeah.
Yes. He one of my favorite phrases from the Pali Canon is when this happens a number of times, when somebody from another tradition challenges the Buddha or says he disagrees with him. And the Buddha says, if you're prepared to talk on the basis of truth, we might have some conversation about this. It's a lovely, lovely invitation to talk, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. But I suppose also, we're not going to get very far if you're not interested in the truth.
Yes, yeah. And later on, what often happens is it's a bit rather Socratic, actually. The Buddha's talking to this man, asking questions, and he says, be careful. What you just said now doesn't agree with what you said a few moments ago.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't add up. It's not reasonable.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Indeed. Sort of caring, logical discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could go back to something you mentioned earlier, Advayacitta, about, you said it was especially important now. And I know what you mean, but I wonder whether we shouldn't make that a bit more explicit. What was on your mind there?
That group think, shall we call it that, and group behavior, tribal behavior is very strong now. I think in terms of dominant political philosophy in the West, that's been adopted by the elites, for example, but also the wider world. And I'm thinking of the horrible things happening in the Middle East at the moment, and people being, very much caught in groups and groupthink. Yeah, to me, I'm seeing, I don't know if it's a return to, group behavior, but it's seems to be becoming very more important, at least in the way it's affecting the Western world now, because I think we were able to escape it to a certain extent, sort of group behavior, with the development of democracies, although I think these days they're hardly functioning properly at all. So, my concern is that we don't just get caught in ancient group tribal behavior again, and somehow are able to learn from what human beings developed in the Western world, 20th century, and also from the Dharma, from the Buddha.
Yes, certainly Britain and America, the politics have become much more polarized than they were.
Oh, indeed.
And the people often say that in Britain it happened because of Brexit, and in America it happened because of Trump.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting. In Sangharakshita's lecture, Evolution or Extinction, a Buddhist view of world problems, he said that all world problems are group problems.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And then when you look at it, it is, isn't it? Israel, Hamas, that's group problem. Russia, Ukraine, that's a group problem. Any problems that come up in the world are to do with groups.
Yes.
And that means, you said at the beginning of this interview, I think it was you or me, I can't remember which one, which is that this is a really, really important topic. The only way we're going to get out of the messes that we've all got ourselves into as a species is by developing individuality, or at least some people developing enough individuality to have an effect on the world.
Indeed. Yes, I'm thinking I better get down to it.
Yes, yes.
I'm thinking, but I suppose as Buddhists, we need to take it on as a responsibility.
Yeah.
Indeed, and sort of perhaps support and other people who are going against the group, shall we say, group thinking.
Yes.
Right.
I came across something interesting, really. It's in Andy West's book, The Grip of Culture, and he clarified something for me which I'd never. What I didn't actually agree with. It was something that Sangharakshita said many years ago in an aphorism: the group is always wrong. And I thought, I don't think that's true. Is it always wrong? But in this book, Andy West talks about what he calls cultural entities. And what a cultural entity is: a bunch of people who have come to a conclusion, or they all agree in one conclusion. And that conclusion is usually not accurate. Take the instance of climate change, which the book goes into climate change quite a lot. Those people, the activists and so on, who want governments to change their behavior and go down to net zero and so on, they don't really know enough about climate change to be able to be sure, could be certain about their position. But that doesn't matter to the group, because they feel sure, because they're in a group that feels sure.
Oh, indeed.
And no cultural entity or no group has the truth. They have an approximation to it, perhaps, but they don't really have the truth. And so what that means is that groups are always feel they have the truth, and therefore they feel it's okay to act on the basis of that truth and force other people to act on the basis of that truth. And that's why individuals are important, because they might pop their head up above the parapet and say, wait a minute, though, that isn't actually true, is it? And of course, you get your head blown off by doing that.
Indeed. Indeed. Right. I'm just aware of the time.
Yes.
Is there
it's
any
time to finish, I think? Yeah. Well, I think I'd like to end, because this is an Appamada interview, and you and I and a few other people began Appamada for this very reason, that there were strong elements of group behavior coming into our movement and our order, and we wanted to say, hey, wait a minute, guys, stop doing that. But I think for many people, we're just seen as just another group. And very often people think of us as a right-wing group. That's the way we're pasted to be. And I'm always wondering about that possibility. Wait a minute. Are we just another group? Are we just another group coming into play here? I really, really hope we're not. But I think it's always something that we should be talking about amongst ourselves, because groupthink, you mentioned groupthink. Groupthink is when a bunch of people come together and they all agree on something and they all keep on buttressing each other's opinions. and in the end, it ends up the ending is always bad. So I think we would say, no, we're not another group. We are a bunch of people trying to be individuals who can see group behavior having a very bad effect, not just on the world, but on our movement as well. But I think we always need to be open to people's criticism of us and thinking about it.
Oh, indeed, and open to disagreement between us. Yeah, I'm
Yes.
sure there'll be a whole variety of topics if we went into it we disagree on, because to some degree or other.
Yes.
The point is that can be very rich. Actually, being able to discuss disagreements and different opinions and different perspectives actually helps one develop one's understanding of the world. I think it's a bit like, how science can proceed. It needs contrary voices and contrary evidence at times to go further. But yes, I mean, we must be careful not to be just another group. I suppose easier said than done. but let's try.
Oh, it's much easier said than done. It is so hard. When I was a young man and I came across, I was 21 when I first heard about the individual. I thought, oh, that's great. And I naively thought, oh, now I'm going to be an individual instead of being a group member. Decades later, I'm still struggling and trying to develop my individuality. And so little areas that I think, oh, of course, yeah, I see now I've been a group member in that respect for a long time. And I thought I was an individual. It's very, very difficult.
Indeed. Well, I suppose it shows that our practice and our development in all sorts of ways, bit by bit.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I think perhaps we should end it there. Thank you very much for your ideas on the individual. And perhaps it's a subject to which we could return at some point.
There's so much more to say on it, yes. But thank you also for your questions. I appreciated it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye, folks.